If you're enjoying this podcast from us here at Which, then why not become a Which member? Right now, we've got a special offer, especially for podcast listeners, meaning you can choose any of our 3 membership tiers for 50% off the usual price. Starting at just £39.50 for a full year, you can get Which magazine delivered direct to your door. For the same price, you could also choose a digital Which subscription, giving you access to all of our product reviews, the Which app, and the digital edition of Which magazine. What's more, you'll also be able to use the Ask Which service for personalised one-to-one buying advice. Or why not get a full access Which subscription for just £49.50 for a full year? Don't forget, that's 50% off the usual price. To join Which or to find out more, just head to which.co.uk/podcast offer. That's which.co.uk/podcast offer, or click the link in the description for today's podcast for 50% off a Which annual subscription.
Settling the affairs of a loved one is never easy, but new research from Which shows that banks and the probate service are causing unnecessary delays. Welcome to Which Money. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Ariano, and with me I have an all-star cast from Which. I have Holly Lanyon from Which Money. Hello, Holly.
Hi.
And James Buchan from the Which legal team. Hello, James.
Hi, Lucia. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you all. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Shall we start right at the top with this one? I mean, James, can you give us an overview of what probate actually is?
So probate is the way of when somebody dies, it may be necessary in order to deal with their affairs to get something called a grant of probate. And probate is a Latin term which literally means to prove. And so probate literally is the act of proving somebody's will, if you like. So it is going through the probate process with the probate registry in order to get your kind of golden ticket, as it might be, the grant of probate, which then enables you as the executor to then deal with the assets in somebody's estate. So that could be to sell or transfer a property, or to close a bank account, or sell shares and do those kind of things. If you don't have a will, the term, you are what's called intestate, and then you get something called a grant of letters of administration. But generally the term probate is used as like a catch-all for all those applications that go to the probate registry in order to deal with those estates.
And today we're going to be talking about delays. But just to give a bit more context, can we just run through what the process should look like? You know, what are the steps you'd need to take if you're named the executor of someone's will?
So the first step is to kind of assess the estate and understand what is in the estate and what the value of the estate is. And then when you know the value of what's included, that then determines what application you need to make. So it may be that you need to do a full inheritance tax return if you've got a taxable estate, or there's certain allowances that you want to claim. That's called an IHT 400, and then you kind of do that along at the same time you do your application for probate. If you're not a taxable estate, or you're not trying to claim any allowances that are out of the ordinary allowances, if you like, you can do an application to the probate registry online using a form called a PA1P or a PA1A if you don't have a will, and then you complete that form and you add the details about the estate onto that form, and the application goes digitally through to the probate registry. And then if you have a will, you send that via post to the probate registry. Then when you've got your grant of probate, you can then deal with assets in the estate, like transferring a property or selling shares, or if you've got large bank accounts or investments, you can then cash them in.
Now, already it seems like there are many layers to this, and I know that's just right. What it should look like in a nutshell. So I suppose, Holly, should we bring you in now then and hear about the investigation you've been doing, and can you give us some of the headlines?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, delays with the probate registry in England and Wales are kind of what sparked this investigation. We wanted to hear from executors about how those delays had affected them, and also hear about their experiences dealing with banks once they've been granted probate. In terms of the headlines, so what we found is that when it came to dealing with a bank once they've been granted probate, unfortunately lots of people just found it really difficult. So 1 in 5 of the people that we surveyed who'd dealt with someone's affairs in the last 2 years said they found that the process was actually quite difficult dealing with their bank. and the same proportion were dissatisfied with their provider's skill and knowledge. So unfortunately, at a time that's already quite difficult, we just found that banks were putting up like unnecessary obstacles. There were mistakes, sometimes lack of knowledge from staff, that were just making what is already quite a complicated administrative process, as James has said, making that even harder.
And I know you've spoken to a number of Which members directly, and you've heard some really extreme cases. Can we hear some of the case studies? Just because I feel like that really does kind of bring this to life.
I'll tell you a little bit about Claire. So really tragically, both of her parents died within the same week. So when she was going through this probate process, she was dealing it for like two parents at the same time, which already must have been really tough. And what can happen sometimes when someone dies and you let the banks know, they'll normally like freeze all of the accounts immediately, but you can arrange for funeral expenses to be paid out before probate's granted, which is what Claire had done. And so her parents had a joint bank account with Halifax, and the funeral director had sent 2 invoices to Halifax for them to be paid directly from the account, one for her father and one for her mother. One was paid without issue, but the other, it didn't get paid. Didn't hear anything from Halifax. It was only when the funeral director got in touch with Claire and said, some of this money for the funeral still hasn't come through, that she realised something had gone wrong. So she went back to the bank, and basically what had happened is that her mother had been completely removed from the joint account. So when the invoice came through, the names didn't match and Halifax just wouldn't pay it. But I think what was difficult about that case is kind of rather than getting flagged with Claire at some point, or it's clear that something had gone wrong, but no one told her, and it wasn't until the funeral director flagged it that she realised there was an issue. When she did speak to Halifax, they really rectified the situation as they should have done, and she ended up receiving some compensation, and luckily it was all sorted. But it's just those kind of administrative errors that I think are really stressful and just really unnecessary at a time like that.
There's a level of communication that you really expect, isn't there? Especially given the circumstances. I mean, James, what do you make of this case? And I suppose you must have come across many, many examples like this and, similar.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as Holly said, that the approach that banks take is all very much individual to the bank. So there isn't a kind of a uniform process. If you could just have one uniform process where if everybody had acted in the same way, or you just uploaded something to one place and it went to everybody, that would make everything very much more simple. But I think the problem that you've got is like all of the banks have individual processes. So some you have to go into branch, some you have to email them, some you have to call them, and so it's kind of like it's very haphazard in terms of what you need to do, and a lot of people don't know. A lot of the big banks used to have bereavement teams years ago, which were actually quite good because they obviously that was their specialist thing to deal with people's accounts where they died. But unfortunately, we've tended to find over the past 5 to 10 years that there's been a real move away from that, and it's actually just been a kind of a more generalized thing. So it really depends. I mean, the vast majority of the time, it's fine. I will say that I will caveat what I'm saying. The vast majority of times, it is fine, and that's what we are finding. But there are instances, and I've had issues. I mean, when I was in private practice a long time ago, I was dealing with an estate where my firm were the executors, and we used to be next door to a Lloyd's bank. And I went in just to say, I'm about to go on holiday. I'm just bringing you a death certificate so you can freeze the account, so I know nothing's going to go on whilst I'm away. And they wouldn't let me walk out of that bank without a cheque for nearly £50,000. Now, all I had was a copy of a will and the death certificate, and I wasn't asked for any details. I could have been anyone, and they were insistent on me walking away with a very, very large amount of money. Now, obviously, it's fine for me. I'm a solicitor. It went straight into our client account, and it was fine. But it's one of those things there. I could have been somebody that was, doing something that they shouldn't have been. So I think it's really hard. And I think when somebody has died, it's all a very alien process. You're bereaved. You're trying to kind of navigate all of that, and then you're met with this very kind of clunky journey, and you're not necessarily getting the right information from the right people who should be kind of helping you and giving you kind of what you need in order to make it a little bit easier. So I can see why. But yeah, in short to your question, yes, I've had some horror stories with banks and investment shares, those sort of things, where people have really had a difficult time and shouldn't have really.
that was something that lots of the executives mentioned to us, and something that Claire said specifically, is that just wishing there was like a point of continuous contact that you could have with the bank who, you know, understands what's happened, understands the state of your case, and the kind of support that you're going to need would make that whole journey so much easier.
And James, you mentioned earlier that there have been cuts to bereavement teams at banks. I mean, is this what's causing the problems, or are there other elements here?
I don't know. I don't necessarily think it is. I mean, obviously, some banks never used to have specialist bereavement teams, and you know they managed to deal with it. I think that there's a lack of training, particularly in branch, about understanding what probate is and what the probate process is, and actually understanding the bank's own probate process. And so I think that there's, you know, some banks are pretty good when you go into branch if they've had good training and they're able to deal with it, whereas sometimes in branch we've had some quite difficult, you know, stories where people have really struggled. It's like that example that Holly gave about Claire. I knew exactly why that would have happened, and that's because when you've got two people that own a joint bank account, whoever received the first death certificate would have been removed from that account, and it would have transferred automatically to the surviving owner, which I think would have been the husband in that situation. So when the bank obviously received the wife's bill for her funeral, they would have said, well, it's not her account because her name's not on the account. Now, it wouldn't have taken 2 minutes to have looked and seen the history of the account and what's happened. But that's just, again, a lack of understanding of the and if there'd have been somebody that had been dealing with that, they would have known. So, yes, it's one of those things where I don't know if it's necessary. They don't have bereavement teams, dedicated bereavement teams, but I think from my experience, it was easier to deal with those bereavement teams than generally kind of what you tend to get now, which is that anybody who has kind of had some training can pick it up and deal with it.
And is there a way then that we can speed up the general process? Can we hear a little bit about, you know, how long it might take doing it the paper way and doing it the digital way, Holly?
Yeah, so in general, the advice, if possible, when it comes to applying for probate in England and Wales, definitely try and apply online. There'll be some cases where you can't and they're more complex and you'll have to do a paper-based application. But in general, the applications are approved much more quickly for online. And we did hear a lot of positive experiences from people who'd used the online service. I think one of the members we spoke to had their application approved in like less than 10 minutes or something. So it can go very smoothly. At the moment, I think it's taking around 4 weeks on average for online applications to be approved, and a bit longer for paper.
Just adding to what Holly said, that it's relatively smooth. If it's relatively smooth, if there's a problem with the application, that's when I think we tend to be seeing significant delays in terms of application. So if somebody hasn't completed the paperwork right, or there's an issue with the will, that's when we tend to be seeing real issues and delays. And I think part of that goes back to, I mean, when I was in practice years ago, before there was this drive with the probate registry to be digitalised and more streamlined, you had probate registries in all of the local kind of big towns and cities. And if you had an issue, you could actually phone them up and speak with the registrar or deputy registrar, and, you know, say, I've got this issue. I think this is what I need to do. Is that kind of how you want it? And they would talk you through what they needed. And then, you know, if you needed it expediting, you could speak to them and they would kind of put it through as a favour, if you like, to trying to get it through quickly. But I think what we tend to find with since the switch to a more digitalized process, which I think the whole reason behind it was to try and make it quicker and to make the process cheaper, is actually what we've seen is that it now takes a lot longer generally to get grants of probate. And we find that the quality of the help and the guidance that's being given by the probate registry is a lot poorer, if you like, than it used to be a long time ago, because they have reduced significantly the amount of registrars and the experienced staff that work in the probate registry. So whilst I think that, you know, going digitalized and having that thing has its positives, I think on the whole the service is it's a poorer service than it used to be. And that's had some teething issues. It may take time to kind of come out the other end. And, you know, I'm hoping that it is going to improve significantly. I think it has, Holly, from what you're research shows that things have got better significantly over the past few years. But I think that there are instances certainly that we have experienced where the probate registry are telling people wrong, or they're requesting things that they don't need, and actually it's creating an awful lot of problems for people that are dealing with estates themselves, that they're being asked for things and they just don't need to provide, and they're therefore getting themselves in a bit of a panic and and not really understanding what they're being asked for.
And you made a point there about wills, and I suppose the idea of wills being watertight and saying exactly what you need them to say. Does it kind of come back to that? And, just how important, would you just want to stress how important getting your will right is?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's as I always say to anybody, nobody has to make a will in the UK. We have testamentary freedom, but if you don't have a will, then you get what you get, which is the intestacy rules, and that may not benefit the people that you want to benefit. So the best way you can do that is to make a will. There's no such thing as a watertight will. Any will can be challenged, whether it's a perfectly valid, perfectly legal will and it's all fine. It could still be challenged, and whether that challenge would succeed or not is a different matter. But any will, any estate can be challenged. But I think if you have a will, you have your wishes down in writing. It's a legal document which actually sets out what you want to happen. What I would also suggest is that if you're doing something in your will which could be potentially controversial, so if you're not providing for somebody or you're leaving an unequal provision or something on those lines, is actually write your wishes down in a letter and explain to your executors why you've done that. I don't mean like a blow-to-blow account like EastEnders. I think because obviously that letter of wishes could become a public document one day if there is a court hearing, and you don't want kind of all of your dirty laundry being kind of aired in an open forum. But really kind of keep quite basic facts. If you've got a child, for example, you haven't seen them for 25 years, there's nothing wrong with just saying, I have a child, I haven't seen them, I've not supported them, that's why I haven't made provision for them. You don't need all the kind of the background history, but that then just helps explain why you've made your will in the way you've made it. And then if there are any claims, your kind of voice can be heard, if you like. So I think it's really important, first of all, to have your will. Make sure you review it every now and again. It's one of those things, I've done it, thank goodness, I can put it in the drawer and forget all about it. But actually you need to review it, and you need to look at it every few years, or if there's a life-changing event like a child or a grandchild or a marriage or a divorce, and update your will and change it as time goes by. And I think people forget that. I think they think I've made my will and then I can forget all about it. And actually, unfortunately, a will is kind of not a lifetime lasting document, if you like. As things change, you might never need to change it, but it's worth looking at it and to make sure. But yeah, have a will in place, and you get what you want. If you don't have a will, you get what you get, which is the intestacy rules, really.
And just while we're on that, should we just quickly go into this? The phrase you're using, the intestacy rules, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So if you die without a will, you're called an intestate, and that basically means is you don't have a testamentary document, a will in effect. And so who inherits in there's like a strict list of who inherits. So if you are married, and you have no children, then your spouse would inherit everything. That didn't used to be the case. Actually, it only changed quite recently. But if you have children, then the spouse gets a set amount, and then the rest is divided in two, and half will go to the spouse and half will go to the children. So it's if you're unmarried, the intestacy rules do not recognise unmarried partners. So if you're cohabiting and you would want your partner to inherit something and you've made no will, they aren't recognised under the intestacy rules. So if you're unmarried, it's actually really important to make a will to make sure that you're not in a civil partnership, that your partner does actually inherit something rather than not, and that could leave them in quite a difficult position if they're not a homeowner or something on those lines. So it's really important that the intestacy rules are quite strict, and if that doesn't fit with your lifestyle or your family situation, it's really, really important that you do make a will.
Thanks, James. And shall we bring in banks now then? Because I know, Holly, that you've been speaking to banks about this, and we do know that dealing with banks during this time, as we've spoken about, can be a hurdle. So what do the banks have to say?
Yeah, so we spoke to 25 major banks about the provision and the support that they have in place for bereaved customers. And all of us told us that they have special policies designed specifically to support bereaved customers. I think what we found in our research is that point that James was making about there's a kind of something's getting lost in translation when our staff like fully aware of these policies and really understand how to enact them or why they're in place or what the kind of support they're supposed to be offering to customers. And that's something we found in our survey, in our customer research. Lots of people were telling us that staff were really lovely, staff were really compassionate, but they just didn't really understand the kind of ins and outs of the policies or why things were a certain way. So I think one member told us that they went and spoke to their staff in branch who told them one thing. And then when they did speak to the specialist bereavement department, they got told, a completely different set of requirements, which obviously just makes this process, which is already new and yeah, it might be your first time doing it, like James said, just makes that even more confusing.
And Holly, I found it interesting, reading your article, that not all high street banks fared the same. How did banks do and which ones came out, top and bottom?
Yeah, so we asked executors how they rated their bank in terms of their skill and knowledge during this process of estate administration. And we did find some big differences. So at the top of the table, Santander did well. So 80% of the executors who banked with Santander told us that they were satisfied. At the other end of things, so HSBC scored 56% and Barclays scored 62%. So obviously there's this big variation between how executors find it working with providers. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do. It will be about, the bereaved and where they held their accounts, who you end up dealing with.
And so do you think anything is likely to improve? Is the FCA looking into this?
So the FCA published a review actually in April. So they worked with retail banks looking at the customer journeys for bereaved customer journeys and those with power of attorney. And their findings were mixed. They found some evidence that the consumer JC was working really well to support vulnerable customers. Lots of banks have bereavement policies in place, but they did also find lots of areas for improvement. So, and they were quite clear that no bank can afford to be complacent in this area, particularly around areas like ensuring staff are fully aware of and trained in the policies. And when errors are introduced, like when errors do occur, making sure that some sort of feedback loops are there in place. So there's additional training or competency checks to make sure the kind of same issues don't repeat themselves.
It does seem like to me, and it's come up a few times during this conversation, that there might be a lack of kind of standardization across the board. James, you're nodding. Is that something that you'd agree with, that there needs to be a little bit more of that?
Yeah, there does. And I think that the problem is there's no reason why it can't be standardized, because it is the same process. The information that you're requesting and what you're asking is the same. It's, you're asking for the same thing. Every estate should request the same information. And if you're going through the probate process, at the end, you're either closing an account or the funds are being transferred into another account. So either way, that account is closing and the money is going somewhere. So there's no reason why there shouldn't be a standardized, why the FCA, for example, couldn't say this is the standardized process and every bank follows that. But it's, for example, the amount of money banks will release without there being a grant of probate varies wildly. So some banks will release, if you've got more than £5,000 with that bank, they won't release the money without a grant of probate. Whereas some banks, it's up to £50,000, and which is a lot of money. And I think what's not explained very well to people with the banks is that actually when you sign that form to say, yes, I'm the executor to release the money without a grant of probate, actually what you're saying is that there's no other assets in the estate and that this is the only asset. And actually you could be closing loads of different bank accounts up to 20, 30, 40,000 pounds and cashing all the money in, when actually that's not what you should be doing. And even the bank's forms are saying that. But again, I don't think that's something, for example, if it's dealt with in branch, that they're necessarily getting over to people that you should only be closing the account in certain circumstances. So I think I think it's one of those where the FCA probably needs to lead on this in order to try and get the banks to act in a uniform way and have uniform set amounts and to have a process and all the forms be standardized. But I don't know if that will ever happen. I've been doing this, nearly 20 years, a long time, and it hasn't changed the kind of the you have had some changes, but it hasn't changed in a uniform way so that everybody is doing the same things. I don't know if we'll ever get to that point, but it seems to me that there's no reason why we couldn't get there. It just seems to be a bit of joined up thinking that needs to be done, really.
Because it does feel like, even each part of the journey, how long that should take should really be part of some kind of standardized process. And that would really help in terms of, knowing if you are being treated fairly or not along the way, because we probably should just get into, if you don't feel like you've been treated fairly, what should you do next? Could you end up going to the Financial Ombudsman Service with a complaint?
Yeah, unfortunately, as we've been talking about, it doesn't always go smoothly. And lots of the executives that we spoke to told us they ended up having to raise a formal complaint with their provider. Oftentimes that going through that formal complaints process was enough to kind of get some progress on their case. Definitely, if things aren't getting better, you should take your case to the Ombudsman. And I would say really important, kind of keep records along the way of conversations that you have with your provider. Make sure you've got kind of, a detailed timeline of what happened, because all of that will be really useful information for the Ombudsman. Another one of the case studies that we spoke to went through the complaints process with Barclays. In the end escalated to the Ombudsman, and at that point Barclays did agree to provide money as a gesture of goodwill. So it can be an effective way to get a case progressed.
And it's really important that customers just even know that that's possible to do that. And I suppose then, before we wrap up for today, I suppose any general advice that you'd like to stress, but also it might just be useful to give a bit of advice. If anybody is named as an executor, what should they do, if anything? What can they do to prep? James, do you want to start us off with that one?
I mean, I always compare being an executor to like moving house. Like if you're moving house, you have to make a list of everything you need to do, and that is what you're doing. Really, you're having to sort out all of the utilities, all the bank accounts, all the investments, property, the cat, the dog, and all those sort of things. It all needs, it's a huge job. And I think if somebody asks you to be an executor, really think carefully before you say yes, because actually it is an awful lot of work that is involved, from registering the death to organising the funeral to organising the wake to sorting out the bank accounts to doing the taxation. And I think it's also really important that people remember that, if you're reporting an estate for tax purposes, for inheritance tax purposes, and you get it wrong, there can be a personal liability that you could actually be held personally liable. So it could actually be you that ends up paying a fine, for example, if you've reported something incorrectly. And so what I would say is, if you're not sure of the process, but you want to be an executor because it's a close family relative or a friend, is go and get some advice, and not necessarily asking a solicitor to do the probate process for you, but go and get some advice and actually find out what is involved and what you need to do before you do anything. Because once you start, you can't stop. You're then doing something what's called intermeddling, which sounds quite serious, but it basically means that once you've taken on the role of an executor and you've started to act as an executor, you can't then stop. You have to carry on. So before you start doing anything, I would say go and get some help and ask what is involved. And actually, if you think, actually, I need some help with this, get some quotes for dealing with certain elements of the probate, and make sure that you are fully armed with everything that you need to do before you then start on the process. Because I've seen lots of horror stories with people with great intent and being the executors and got themselves into a bit of a mess later on down the line because they've not notified the insurer that the person's died, and that invalidates the insurance, or there's all those sorts of things that people don't think about that you need to do. So as housekeeping, you're moving house, what do you need to do? It's exactly the same, but then there's actually more complications as well with dealing with the probate applications and all those sorts of things.
We probably should also just shout out that if you do need help with probate or managing an estate, there is of course Which Legal. And James, how can Which Legal help it in those situations?
So we have a team of 3 really excellent solicitors who are wills and probate lawyers, and we can't do the application for you, but we can hold your hand throughout the whole of the probate process. If you phone up and make an appointment with one of our team, they can explain what you need to do, how you need to do it, when you need to do it, and assist you in making sure that you are getting everything right. So it's a bit like helping you get to the next stage. And then when you've got there, you can phone the team back up and say, right, I've got my grant of probate. What do I do now? And they can then talk you through the process in order to every stage during probate. So we find we get some excellent feedback and some really, really great results from people who really value our service in order to make sure that they give them the peace of mind to make sure that they're dealing with everything correctly without the great expense of going to a solicitor, who will charge whatever they charge in order to deal with the estate for you.
Well, thank you. And we'll pop a link to Which Legal in the description of today's show, so you can have a look if you want to find out more about that. And Holly, is there any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything you'd like to add to what James was just saying, or anything from what we have said or haven't said today that you'd just like to stress?
Yeah, on that point about being an executor, I spoke to lots of people during this research, and I think as well, something that lots of people brought up was just, the importance to be kind to yourself during the process, lean on friends and family. It's a lot of administrative work. You have to be really organised. But you're going through something really tough. You're grieving. Multiple other people that I spoke to just shouted out, what a rock their partner was or their friends were during that process. So just to remember that part of looking after yourself as well as all the practical and legal stuff.
Thanks, Holly. A really important note to end on. And it's been a really important show. So thank you both so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Which, the UK's consumer champion. You can find plenty more advice about what we discussed today in the show notes. There you'll also find a link to become a Which member for 50% off the usual price, an offer exclusively available to you, our podcast listeners. Joining Which will not only give you access to our product reviews, our app, one-to-one personalised buying advice, and every issue of Which magazine across the year, but you'll also be helping us to make life simpler, fairer and safer for everyone. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. That way you'll be notified whenever we release a new episode of Which Money, Which Shorts, or any other podcast that we make for you. And if you want to get in touch with us, then follow us on social media at Which UK or drop us an email to podcast@which.co.uk. See you next time.
Do you want to reduce your energy bills? Or maybe you want to use greener energy? Go solar and get a discount. Right now, Which members can get a 7.5% discount on solar panels and their installation if you use Heatable, a Which Trusted Trader approved service. You can also include a storage battery and EV charger, handy if you're looking at making the switch to an electric car. To make use of this exclusive offer, simply head to which.co.uk/solar-offer. That's which.co.uk/solar-offer before the 30th of September 2025. And if you're not already a Which member, you can grab a year's membership for 50% off the usual price. To do that, go to which.co.uk/podcast offer to get involved. Start your solar journey today. Go solar and get a discount with Which.